Welcome, welcome. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are today. We're so excited that you have chosen to join us here to talk about the future of work. And I am so excited to introduce you to a couple of my colleagues and guests. And so here today we have with us Dr. Woodrow Winchester III and Dr. Rosalind, and she goes by Ros Cohen. And so let me introduce myself to you first. If you're new to engineer inclusion, my name is Meagan Pollock. I am based out of Dallas. No, I'm not in Dallas, Texas anymore. I just moved. Goodness, I live in Orange, Texas now. I actually bought a little figurine that just came in the mail yesterday. This cute little orange here. I just 3 months ago moved to where I grew up and bought my first house. So yes, I live in Orange, Texas, a small town in rural Southeast Texas. And my company is called Engineer Inclusion, and I have the privilege and honor of getting to help people intentionally and systematically engineer equity and inclusion into their organizations while really caring for their people and the community. And so today I want to introduce you to, let's start with Woodrow, because he and I manifested this idea first to have this live conversation. So Woodrow, why don't you say hi?
Hi. So great to be a part of this conversation this afternoon or morning. Again, as Meagan articulated, wherever you're located. I'm also in Texas, in Austin, Texas, currently at the University of Texas at Austin, where I am the executive director of the Texas Executive Engineering Education Unit, which is roughly the continuing education unit within the Cockrell School of Engineering here at UT Austin. Just want to give a shout out to my home institution where I obtained my PhD. That's North Carolina A&T State University. I think there may be an Aggie on the call today, so I thought I saw a name that looked familiar to me, but maybe not. But yeah, did my PhD work at North Carolina A&T State University, and originally from Greensboro, North Carolina. What also brought me to the conversation, not only Meagan, and I know she wanted us to add this as well, because this is an additional sort of layer of perspective that I think I will be able to bring to the conversation, is that I am fairly new as a people leader, especially in the context of an academic unit of the size that I'm currently managing and leading. So close to about 20 folk. Really, this really kind of touches home, and I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation to not only offer some insight and perspective, but also to learn.
Thanks so much, Woodrow, Dr. Winchester. And I want to introduce you now to Dr. Ros Cohen, who is a newly minted doctor. So let's all congratulate her for her success and her defense of her dissertation. So Dr. Ros, tell us, welcome. Who are you and why'd you choose to be here with us today?
It's a great question. Well, my name is Ros Cohen. I live in San Francisco, originally from New York, so sometimes you'll hear a little bit of that East Coast slip out, particularly when I get excited about something. What brought me to the conversation was, I will be totally honest, is I was fangirling over Meagan at one point, because I had watched her TED Talk and was like, oh my God, she's amazing, and reached out to her and said, I am getting my dissertation and in the process of defending, and would just love to have a couple of conversations with you. I think you're right, Woodrow. I think we all are fangirling over her. So that's really how Meagan and I met. My dissertation, and let me take even a step back. I've working in HR in a variety of different capacities for about 20 plus years, so have been people leading for a very long time. My dissertation was specifically around inclusive leadership and employee engagement and how those things intersect, and then looking at ways in which identity can be affected or affect inclusive leaders. So this is a topic I'm incredibly passionate about, and so much so that about a year ago, I started my own consulting practice called Socius Strategies. And I'm super excited to be here with these two amazing people to have this conversation. So thank you, Meagan.
Thanks, Roz, and y'all are over here making me blush, so thank you for that. And so another perspective that Roz brings is she has a rich HR background, right? And that's something that's certainly really valuable to this conversation. And so we've got the perspective from HR, we've got the perspective from teaching and training, and then my experience, talking about this as a consultant in this space, but also certainly my experience in working in industry. Like all of us have this work experience. So work is, and culture and climate is something we all experience each and every day. And so I want to also welcome our participants and acknowledge that you all bring together your own expertise and to this conversation. And so I have set up a Slido poll for us to use as a kind of a background. And so if you're new to Slido, it's quite simple to use. I think we all use a lot of QR codes now. It's easiest to use if you use your phone. So just open up the camera, hover the camera over that QR code, and select the little bubble that says open in whatever browser that you use. And then as we go through, I won't be showing the screen the entire time. Whoops, I won't be showing the screen the entire time, but it will be there. And so I'm going to be trying to pay attention to that as well, to see what it is that you all are contributing to us through the Slido. And so you're welcome to introduce yourself there and to share why you chose to attend. If that's problematic, just use a chat. I've got the chat open as well, and then that will help us stay in tune with what you're contributing. And so while y'all are doing that, I'm going to go ahead and step forward and offer a couple of key terms to situate the conversation today. So how we pitch this is talking about the future of work through the lens of workplace trends, things that we're seeing like the Great Resignation, the quiet quitting. A new one I heard this week is quiet firing, right? And so we've got lots of these trends that have been bubbling up in the news over the last couple of years, but I believe that many of these really stem back to culture and climate. So let's just talk about the key terms. So as I'm doing this, I want you to also think, what do these things mean to me, right? So this is just good learning strategy, get those neurons firing to help you understand how you process this information. So culture, by a very basic definition, it is all of the patterns of human behavior that include our thoughts, our communications, our actions, our customs, the ways that we do things, our beliefs, our ideologies. It includes our values, but it also includes these sort of institutions of socially constructed things around race and ethnicity and religion and all kinds of social groups. And why culture is important for us to think about is because it shapes our beliefs. And it forms our biases about people based on their age, their gender, their race, their language, their ability status, their class, their income level, and so many other factors. And it often does this without our own realization. And for many people, particularly those people from the dominant culture, we don't actually understand and see our culture as culture, right? And we don't see it as culture because it's what is so dominant in the world that we live in. This is something that many white people like myself have sort of faced as an adult of like, what do you mean I have culture? Like, we don't know it's culture because it's like telling a fish water's wet, right? Like it's just what you sort of live and breathe every day. But we do have culture. And just like we as individuals have culture, every environment that we are in creates its own culture, right? So you have a team culture, you have an organizational culture, you have a community culture. And so there are norms that are part of each of those things that we are involved in. And the next key term that we're going to be talking today about is about climate. So climate is the way people experience a work environment or an educational classroom and environment or any kind of environment. And it's answering questions like, what is it like for me to work here, right? How do I feel when operating in the culture of whatever space I'm operating in? And how do business conditions, the management decisions, and the actions of our leaders affect the general mood of the space? And so then when we consider this sort of collective experience of all of the talent in a space, in an organization, you're evaluating the climate. And so with these two terms in mind, I'm going to set us up for our first panel question here about the Great Resignation. And so the Great Resignation is something we really started hearing buzz about in about early 21. And so it's been known as the Big Quit, the Great Reshuffle. I've heard things of like the Great Renegotiation, the Great Rethink, so all these kinds of terms, but it's an ongoing trend where people have voluntarily resigned from their jobs en masse. And it like sort of triggered this alert in early 2021 in a perceived wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's a Harvard Business Review article that I'm going to drop the link in the chat and encourage you to read. And I'm also going to share it on the webpage with all of the resources that we share later. But this Great Resignation, they argue that it didn't start with a pandemic. And so the table here, let me make that a little bit bigger for you to see. The Great Pandemic, they argue, was really just exacerbated by the pandemic, because when we see the sort of anomaly of quitting, there are lots of things that are involved. So I encourage you to read that to better understand their perspective. But what I like about how they position this article is that there were 5 factors that were then exacerbated by the pandemic, and that those combined to yield the changes that we've been living through in the labor market. And so they called the factors the 5 R's: retirement, relocation, reconsideration, reshuffling, and reluctance. And quoting from the article, they say that workers are retiring in greater numbers, but aren't relocating in large numbers. They're reconsidering their work-life balance and care roles. They're making localized switches among industries or reshuffling, rather than exiting the labor market entirely. And because of pandemic-related fears, they're demonstrating a reluctance to return to in-person jobs. So I've been thinking about this so much. Instead of those 5 R's, I've had a different R that I've been thinking about. And as I've been reading articles and looking at the research and calling it the Great Realization, like this realization of like, this isn't working for me, folks. Like when I go to work, I experience lots of microaggressions. When I sit at home, I experience less microaggressions, right? And it's this realization that, wow, this culture that I was so deeply embedded in, right? I didn't realize how toxic it was for me. So it's this realization that I can do better for myself. So with that, I want to offer the first question to my panelists. So in what ways do you think that culture and climate have influenced the Great Resignation?
So I'm going to kick it off, if you don't mind, Woodrow. I think one of the things to remember in this is that this is not new. It is a new term, but it's not new. I can think back to 9/11 and sort of the changes that people went through with reassessing who they are, what was important and valuable to them, where they wanted to spend their energy based upon this very catastrophic event. And I like it that there's a similarity between those two. So with that being said, I think what people look at is the culture and climate of their organizations and really put things into perspective and say, is this what I want to be doing? Is this where I want to spend my psychic energy, my physical energy, my emotional energy? Or do I need to rethink about what's important to me and then determine where the environment is best suited for me at that point? So I've been listening to this Great Resignation and just want to remind folks that this is not necessarily new, but it's got a new twist to it.
Thank you for that, Roz. Truly, and it aligns so much with some additional readings that I've read along these lines as well, in terms of this is not really a new phenomena. But it's really interesting too. I was recently at a conference, American Society for Engineering Management, and this was kind of a topic that was thrown to a panel of I would say Gen Zers, right? I think Gen Z, yeah. Get all the generations kind of mixed up, but the more the new entrants into the current kind of workplace. And the question was posed in terms of, what does this term mean to them? And it was really interesting to hear, their response to that. And I think it really aligns with what Meagan is saying and what I'm actually seeing in the context of what's happening in my work context as well. This realization that you truly have, you have options. And I think the Gen Zers, have grown up in a work sort of context where there are, more degrees of freedom. Tie back to the song that we were listening to as we came into the panel today, but degrees of freedom in terms of how to work, and that were not available in such prevalent sort of manners to those of us of previous, generations. So to your point, really coming to that realization that yes, there are options, and and I can be in better situations, better contexts that better align, with what my my values are, and to your point in terms of where I would like to spend my energy, my time, my talent, my resources. So yeah, it's really interesting in that regard, which then truly opens up the door. And I don't know if we're ready to start this thread of conversation around this, but, in terms of as a leader or manager, how to respond to that realization and really kind of do that important work around developing or enabling culture, developing climate to kind of facilitate folk to be, successful and hopefully to realize their potential within given sorts of work context. So yeah, it's really interesting realization from both perspectives, both from an employee perspective and employer perspective as well. And now in this new capacity that I'm in, really been thinking about that hard work that has to happen from a managerial leadership sort of perspective in response to this.
Yeah, when I think about, a lot of the data says that many of the people who were leaving their jobs were in like hospitality and retail. And so we know that like those in-person kinds of jobs were deeply affected, certainly by the pandemic. But there's also this other group of people who have, everybody started working from home, right? And I think about like this sort of cognitive load that people maybe either received a relief from. So certainly by working from home, they had lots of other stressors if they had families and, if they were caregiving and those kinds of things. But so there was different kind of cognitive load. But I think that, when we talk about workplace cultures and these articles by particularly people of color who have experienced so much racial aggression in the workplace, particularly after the sort of pendulum swing of racial consciousness and awareness with George Floyd's murder. So combining that to their experiences, their ability to work from home and sort of almost reduce the impact of so many of these kinds of things. And then as people are saying, hey, come back to the workforce, we're ready for you to come back. And people are like, yeah, I'm good. Like I don't want to come back, and so why this is important for us to understand is that all of these things affect culture and climate. And so Woodrow, to your point, as leaders, who are we paying attention to when people are saying like, I'd really rather work from home, asking why, right? And having that really intentional conversation to understand when people are trying to tell you without maybe telling you the culture and climate of our organization and team is toxic. For me, it's toxic, right? And then what do we do as a leader to respond to that? Do we just say, okay, well, this isn't the place for you, goodbye, peace out? Or are we taking some action to say, wow, you're really giving me some data here, and I need to figure out how to train our team, to adjust our policies and practices to better serve you?
I love your question. I don't want to come back to work. Why? And it's such a simple question because that can be taken by the individual in so many different directions. And maybe it's a mom who wants to be able to throw a load of laundry in and get her kids out to school in the morning. Or maybe it's it's something else. Maybe it is I am trying to survive in an environment that I do not feel like I belong, that I do not feel included, that I do not feel welcome. And so that then does become an issue for an organization to be able to say, what do we need to do to create a sense, excuse me, of inclusiveness and belonging within that organization so that people are recognized for who they authentically are.
Mhm.
So I think that the why question is so simple, but so powerful.
And oftentimes, and I'll speak for myself as a leader of a unit, you're afraid to even ask the question because you're afraid to get that response, because then that puts the onus on you to do something about it. And I think a lot of managers and leaders are not ready to do that work in response to the responses, to the question. And I think oftentimes that's where, it's a function of, I got some notes here. I don't want to go to that because this is just really opening up some really interesting thoughts in the context of where I am at this point. But, in terms of, educating and training, managers and leaders, in terms of how to respond to these sorts of questions, is oftentimes a gap. So, folk in leadership and management positions, especially in engineering and technological sort of context, really don't get the sort of training around, culture and climate and organization, that's really needed to kind of foster the sort of environment, where it's these questions can be asked and things can be kind of responded to. So there's some challenges in that regard as well. Yeah.
So
That was a great question.
Lauren added a great response on the Slido, so I want to share that. So Lauren Kern is from Salis O'Brien, Training and Development Manager, and she says, as much as we perhaps don't want this to be true, I think identity politics are influencing perceptions of culture, especially in STEM industries. People are much more keenly interested in who they will work for and how the company orients itself within the wider society. So Lauren, thanks so much for your contribution there. I appreciate that. And I think that, certainly as a result of the previous administration, when we think about how identity politics have been exacerbated and highlighted in broad and negative ways, we are seeing a lot of this difference, intentions of who people are, and we're seeing so much more divisiveness rather than dialogue and conversation that helps us come together. This also makes me think about looking at the sort of intersections of identity and the function of privilege, right? So when we think about who has the privilege to walk away from a job, and then who doesn't, and then what's the implication of that, and how are we as leaders and managers and whatever circle of influence that we have, really paying attention to and using our global empathic listening skills to understand what people are experiencing, because just because they aren't leaving doesn't mean that they aren't experiencing the same kind of toxic culture, right? And that sort of leads us to the second prompt of talking about this sort of quiet quitting. So maybe they don't have the capacity to leave, to resign, to go find something else. But so quiet quitting, there are lots of sort of terms of this. In some ways, it's people just putting up really good, healthy boundaries, saying like, this is what you pay me to do. These are the hours that I'm paid to work. So I'm going to function within those, right? And so to some degree, that's really healthy. But what the unhealthy side of that from an organizational standpoint is when people and leaders expect people to always go above and beyond, but yet don't reward them in ways that are satisfactory to the employee, right? And so that's when they sort of quietly quit, saying, I'm going to do what you paid me to do, no more, no less. And maybe they're looking for other opportunities along the way. So now back to the panel, what is it that you think the ways in which culture and climate have influenced this quiet quitting, perhaps for people who aren't quite ready to resign?
I think when you talk about organizations and you talk about quiet quitting, I could even say that. What you're talking about is engagement and trust and how those things play together. There are certain behaviors that indicate of managers, when managers act in certain ways, it elicits certain types of engagement from individuals. And we can talk about that for hours. However, when you're talking about engagement, you're talking about discretionary effort. You're talking about that above and beyond. And so if leaders are not acting in ways that develop those levels of trust and develop those types of behaviors like authenticity and sort of act in ways that bring that out in others, people don't feel connected. They don't feel like they belong. And so what ends up happening is they're like, you know what? I'm going to just do these 5 things that you told me to do, and I'm not even going to try any harder because I don't feel as though I'm valued. I don't feel engaged. So I think there is a great connection because there's so many questions happening right now within organizations, in the context of the economy. We're moving into a place of a recession, and what does that mean? And am I going to have my job? And should I even continue to do this work? Or if you have no choice, I'm going to continue to do this work, but I'm only going to do it because this is what you're paying me. And I'm not going to get that additional bonus or that whatever is important to you as an additional piece. So I think it really does tie together, and engagement is inclusive behaviors, and engagement is a very strong component of this.
Wow, I would would totally agree, Roz. Great points, and again, I really kind of see this kind of playing out within the context of my current work situation, and it is quite a challenge from a managerial leadership sort of perspective, in terms of what do you do, what actions can you take, but to your point, I think one of the things that we can do, and what I've tried to do, is as you've articulated, role model those sorts of attributes, characteristics, and facilitating and enable opening space for those sorts of conversations authentically to kind of to happen, but it is kind of a challenge, because even at the managerial leadership sort of perspective, you're dealing with some similar sorts of challenges as well, in terms of your workload, and as you've articulated, with all the changes in the economy, and where you've had to shift and maybe potentially lacking resources, doing more, trying to do more, or trying to do with less. So you're faced with those challenges as well. So yeah, it's really, really, really interesting. But but it goes back to the always, I guess, as an educator, or now in continuing ed, it's like, where do you begin to kind of to learn and understand, kind of what to do, what needs to happen, but those hows in terms of implementing, in terms of to be able to more adequately sort of respond. So that's kind of an additional challenge, which kind of speaks to kind of the art and science, kind of associated with this. We oftentimes get the science aspect of it, but the art is just so critical, especially in the context of the types and levels of change that we see that's happening within organizations.
Yeah, so if for people who are in positions of people management, if you sort of notice your employees, first of all, I think the quiet quitting as a term is like very deficit minded, right? Like, rather than creating, if we don't have a team culture, if we don't have an organization culture that honors balance, and I use quotes because I know that that's sort of like, it's a misnomer that things are ever like truly in balance, but like to have some intention of balance between family and work and life. If we don't honor that, if we don't create that culture of accepting it, then we're complicit in people who feel overwhelmed by these kinds of things. I know when I worked in industry as an engineer years ago, like it was all about the busy badge, right? Like who's the busiest, who's got the most going on. there was this weird competition that I never subscribed to of like, how many time bank hours do you have stocked up that you haven't used? Fortunately for me, that is one trend I never like got stuck on. Like I've always used my vacation. But there was this sort of badge of like, we all overwork, right? Particularly working in engineering, there was an expectation that you had to be there before the boss and stay after the boss. But then by the time you get home, we had to be on the phone with Singapore and Malaysia. So we were on the phone from, 9 to 11 o'clock at night, and then had to start over again every single morning and try to be there before 8. And that's a culture, right? It creates a climate and an expectation of just being present. But does that really drive effort? I was doing some work and reading last night on compliance versus self-regulation. Sort of side note, so like I'm in the process of adopting a child, and one of the things I have to do, like it's required, is I have to write house rules. And I have bristled at this. It's been on my to-do list for 2 months, and because I don't like compliance-based rules, and all the things I'm looking up are like no violence, no lying, no, like everything started with a no, right? And I know the literature that says this doesn't inspire and motivate people, right? And so that's, to me, also the sort of culture that we operate in. If you think about the culture of your team and client, your culture of your team or the climate of your team, if everything sort of starts from that deficit mindset or that sort of no of like, we don't get there after the boss, we don't leave, right? If everything is situated in that gives you a sense of like, does your culture inspire compliance? Because truth is compliance does not relate to motivation and engagement and all of these kinds of things. Whereas self-regulation of like, hey, do I trust you? Are you getting your job done? Am I helping you to be successful? Am I creating an environment that helps you? So these are some things I've been thinking about of like, do we operate from a place of compliance, or are we trying to train and trust our people to self-regulate themselves and to do the kinds of things that they need to do?
Meagan, something you just said strikes me as interesting, which is this concept of quiet quitting. If you think about that, you are actually putting and I'm going to use the term blame or responsibility on the individual. Mm. You're saying that you are leaving the organization, you are moving away from it, versus wondering or asking the question, why? If this person is not as engaged, if they are not as committed, if they are not doing more than they want to be doing outside of that job description, why is that, right? So it really doesn't look at the climate or the culture. It looks at the individual. And now, look, I think that I've always believed that there are two sides to every story. There's one side, there's the other side, and then there's the middle. So I think the same is true here, right? If I'm quietly quitting and you are my boss and the climate is not great, there's somewhere in the middle is the truth or the reality of it. So how do we co-create? How do we work together to figure out what's going on? And I think that's lost in the term quiet quitting, quiet resignation, mm-hmm. however you want to.
Yeah, I think that you're right. Like, this is an accountability question. And I think I also operate from an assumption that people care, right? An assumption that people care about their people care about their employees, because that is also a requirement in creating good cultures and climates, is that you care. Because there are certainly lots of people who don't operate from that ideology that the humanity and people are at the center of what we do. Yeah. What are you thinking, Woodrow?
But no, I love this because, again, living it, and it's interesting, as you think about it conceptually and from a academic sort of perspective, versus living it and putting it into practice. It's always the challenge associated with that. And as you've articulated, Meagan, it's like I look at this, it's like as a leader, I do care, and I really want to have a more responsive and healthy, culture and climate within the organization. But again, it is hard work to kind of foster that. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of add, to step back for just a moment, when you were talking about given kind of defining culture and climate. And that's oftentimes, especially, after the pandemic, and a lot of people have gone through this self-examination in terms of really what it is that they want to do, and kind of understanding values, and to Roz's point, where I want to allocate my time and energy and that sort of thing, and kind of gone through these sorts of exercises. Now I lost my train of thought where I was going to go with this. So self-aware, kind of going through the exercise. What was we were talking about?
It might have to call them.
Accountability.
Quiet quitting, but accountability.
Yeah.
Oh, geez.
You'll come back to it. It's okay.
Yeah, I'll come back to it. But yeah, I was trying to think, because it was a point I wanted to make there. Wow. Yeah,
All
I'll
right.
come back. It'll come back.
Simmer on it. It'll come back. It'll come back.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, again, to Roz's point in the very beginning, like, quiet quitting isn't new. It's just got a name on it. Just like so many other things that have always happened. We just didn't have vocabulary to talk about it in these kinds of ways. And so as leaders and managers, paying attention to your employees, right? Like if you've got overachievers, if you've got sensitive strivers, if you've got people who are really traditionally those who are excelling and taking on all kinds of things, I think that there's probably generally a correlation between when those kind of employees start quitting or pulling back, there's probably a correlation to them asking for more money or a promotion or a new title, and you not giving it to them, right? And so it comes to a point of like, wow, I'm giving everything in and I'm barely even getting a pat on the back, and a pat on the back isn't even always enough. Sometimes it is, right? Sometimes people just want to be appreciated for those things. But when people don't feel valued, affirmed, included, and that they belong, again, this is one of the kinds of results of that. And so I think for leaders and managers and organizations, you have to be attuned and paying attention to your employees. And I think that there's a disproportionate way in which people are not honored. And I mean, we know that there's bias in the workplace. We know that this is particularly around gender and race, and that and there are populations of people, depending on the industry, that are marginalized and excluded in different kinds of ways. And so I think that we have to pay attention to that. Admittedly, I think all of us have probably been in jobs where we were quiet quitting. We just didn't put those words on it because we're like, I'm done, right? Like, I'm done giving everything. And yet you just promoted a man, or the man gets paid more than me and he thinks he's worth more than me. But you want to say, because you're young and don't have any kids, you get to do all of this and just, yay, thank you. Just a lack of.
Your turn's coming.
Say that again.
No. I was saying, just along the same lines of what you're saying. I say, your turn's coming. Just wait on. It's coming. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's just the sort of breadcrumbing, right? Like, just hang on. We're gonna get
there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
that's that.
Go ahead, Woodrow.
Oh, no, please.
I was going to shift us to the next question of like dreaming about the sort of future of work. So this is also a new trend of language that we're seeing, is just like future of work. I sort of noticed this as just a popular hashtag that's been showing up. And I had to Google it. I was like, well, what is the future of work? Right. And there is no like definition, precisely. It's really this sort of belief that the workforce is changing, right? And that, and it has always been changing. That's also not new. But I think that coming out of the pandemic, we have an opportunity and a responsibility to really rethink the workplace, to rethink the ways in which we operate. Admittedly, I've worked from home since 2009, and every year before I was fully self-employed, I would like calculate like how much would it cost for me to actually have to show up to a workplace. And like every year it like got more and more and more, because that freedom that I have working from home and how much it helps me in my own, way of sort of operating in my own health conditions and things like that is really, really critical. And so now I'm like, somebody'd have to pay me a ton of money to make me give up this freedom, right? So to me, the future of work, as certainly as an entrepreneur and as somebody who's worked from home so long, I think it has to pay attention to people and giving more freedom to the ways in which we show up. And the pendulum has absolutely swung, right? From early pandemic to everybody work from home to like, now we don't trust you to do your work, when the work was getting done, right? Like it shifts back to ways of knowing and doing that were defined and prescribed by dominant cultures, right? The sort of white patriarchal ways of knowing and doing are sort of remanifesting in really powerful ways. And to me, that is not the direction that we want to go. So for the two of you, when you think about the future of work, what does that mean? What do you dream of? What does it mean to you?
I think about it, and Woodrow, please jump in if I'm, when I think about the freedom aspect, because I do think that's a key quality.
Yeah.
The time when FaceTime was important, right? If I was in the office X number of hours, regardless of what I was doing, that was an important factor. But here's the tricky part of it. I don't know how big in the majority I am on this, on what I'm about to say, is I do believe there is a level of engagement and a level of connection that only happens when people are in groups together. Yeah. So I vacillate. I go back and forth because I love the freedom. I love being able to go and pick up my kid from school or go see, their track meet or something. And I also love the conversations that happen around the kitchen, when I'm getting a cup of coffee in the morning. What I don't think we have perfected, and where I think all of these things will really come to the crux, is how do you manifest levels of connection and belonging in spaces that are not physically located together. And that to me, when we can figure that out, I think we will expand this topic even further. Yeah. But that, it just doesn't, it's not there. I don't feel connected to my colleagues potentially that are on Zoom. I like them. I think they're great, but it's very different than when I walk in the kitchen at work. Yeah. Or, walk by. I was a director of HR since God was a boy, I joke. And the best conversations that I ever had were when someone came and knocked on my door and said, "Do you have a second?" And it was never a second. And I always had the time. But those 15, 20, 30-minute conversations allowed a relationship, which is really what we're talking about, to develop where people belong. So I think the future of work is about figuring out really how to create those connections that you just can't replicate on video.
Yeah. Oh, I so agree, Roz. And that's one of the things that one of the challenges that I'm faced with here, because we've kind of gone through, we're from the university perspective, we have flexible work arrangements, so folk can, kind of elect a more flexible hybrid sort of schedule. And it's been really interesting because, coming back, from the pandemic, so we have some folk that are in, some folk that do enjoy, periodically coming into the office. Like myself, I come in, every day because I kind of get energy from the environment and being in the office and that sort of thing. But I respect others and their ability to do what needs to be done in differing sorts of modalities of work. But, it is really interesting because we actually had some conversation in a staff meeting the other day, and this kind of came up, in terms of that. We were talking about the topic was civility. So we've been exploring, coming back at the office and what does that mean, and doing some work in terms of, building and enhancing the culture and the climate, of our particular unit. So having these sorts of conversations, and this was the topic of conversation for this particular meeting. And it was really interesting. And, one of the takeaways, and I got a couple emails and a couple of those conversations, Roz, when I came back to my office and I got some knocks. Woodrow, I just want to talk to you for a second. And you're right, it's never a second. And it's always and it's a great, not a second. It's like what some of the most in-depth and really engaging sort of conversation. But it came back to, it really would be nice. And I really think some of these sorts of challenges that we are, experiencing in terms of, how we engage and how we interact would be eased if we did have more time together, as a unit. And again, to both of y'all's points in terms of, me as leader manager listening to this. So then what can I do to kind of facilitate that? So, one of the things that I'm hoping to be able to implement, but again, it's an art and science associated with it. So, it's like, I would like to have certain days or a day, where everyone is in the office, where we have that opportunity to have that sort of face-to-face sort of interactions to kind of to address that sort of need for us to have connections on other sorts of levels, such that it makes communication easier. But doing that within the context of, to y'all's point again, allowing freedom, and being responsive to our flexible working arrangements. And, there may not be a day or days where, we could all be in the office sort of thing. So it's like, weighing policy, with things that you would like to do in terms of, enhancing and developing, culture and climate. So, again, from a managerial leadership sort of perspective, it's hard. Because what you want to do, but then, in terms of the implementation, really becomes, kind of the challenge. So yeah.
I would agree. Oh, go ahead, Megan.
No, Roz, please go ahead.
I also think there's an intentionality, right? You can't just have people in the office to have them in the office. There needs to be intentionality. And what we've seen and what research shows is that there are some behaviors that managers and some actions that they can put forward that bring together people in an inclusive way. Meagan knows this, fair treatment, treating people fairly, being open to differences, being able to share unique perspectives and feel like there's no sense of retaliation, to be able to be authentic. When managers act in those and in a couple of other ways, people feel more connected. They are more engaged. It actually shows that this idea of a shared social engagement, I feel as though the work that I do and the work that I share with other people is important and feels valued. And the idea of positive affective engagement and how I feel about the work that I do. So when managers act in those ways, people are more engaged. And when people are more engaged, they feel like they're more connected to, they feel like they belong. So there needs to be an intentionality and a way in which people respond and act that gives value.
Yeah, thanks, Roz. So I want to draw attention to a contribution by one of our participants, added that work reflects our dominant cultural values. And this is something that we were talking about earlier. And the future version will project the revolutionary changes that we are seeing in our culture. And so hopefully, so thank you for your contribution, whoever that was. And so hopefully we are going to see those positive cultural revolutions, right? And, I think about, Woodrow and Roz, what you were both saying, like really makes me think about this. And again, it's fresh in my mind because I've been writing about it all night, not all night. I did go to bed at midnight, but like thinking about compliance and regulation of like, do we expect compliance or do we trust people to self-regulate, right? Yeah. And so by having this sort of nature of hybrid workplaces, and again, not everything can be hybrid, right? Like I certainly acknowledge that the three of us work in places and ways that allow hybrid to work. If you are a waiter at a restaurant, you can't do that from home, right? Like you got to be present. If you work on a manufacturing line, you can't have that hybrid mode. But I do think that there's so much of the way in which we operate and the culture and the climates that we create and influence is to thinking about, is this based on trust? Are we creating what Roz was saying, creating the psychological safety, which is required, right? When we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, psychological safety And those feelings of like love and belongingness are required before we can get any shit done, folks. Like you got to have those feelings before we can self-actualize and even have any sort of self-esteem about ourselves. And so we have to be paying attention to that culture and climate. And so let's shift now to talking about some more specific strategies. Like, so what are some specific strategies that we can employ to improve culture and climate? So, share these from your own portfolio, resources that you've used, that you teach from. And to all of our participants, feel free to add your resources on the Slido or in the chat as well. We'd love to hear what strategies you have in mind.
So one of the things that I talk about with my clients is this idea of challenge, support, and create. The idea here is that our goal as people within organizations to create this climate of belonging and this climate where people feel included is to first question processes and structures for fairness and equity. Ask the question, why do we do things the way we do? Do we do it that way because it's always been done that way, or is there some rationale behind it? So challenge what the paradigm is that you're operating in. The second then is to support. So you champion groups in their identity and meet them where they are, right? Asking questions such as, how do you create this culture of belonging? Role modeling differences and that differences are okay. Asking individuals how they want to be identified. And it goes beyond pronouns. It goes beyond, not that that's not important, it is, but it's above and beyond that. Do I want to be known as the white woman who has always sort of been there, or do I want to be known for the fact that I'm a New Yorker and I have 2 teenagers, and what is my identity and how can I bring that to work and how can others support me in that identity? And the last piece is to create an environment, as we've talked about, that facilitates honest and open dialogues. Yeah. Ask the question, what can we do as a team in order to be able to make sure that other people's voices are heard? How can we incorporate and allow people to show up authentically? What are the ways in which we can do that in a very, very tangible kind of way? Those are the things that I talk about with my clients all the time, and they help to provide that kind of environment.
We've got a couple of contributions in the chat. So Dr. Hong says challenge and support theory is one of the best. And so I've asked them if they'd be willing to find some links and resources to point us to learn more about that. I'm not familiar with that theory. Then Catherine Reed adds in the chat, restorative practices presents practices and strategies for inclusion, belonging, engagement, ownership, accountability, and shared leadership. And so what I'm going to do is on the same information page on this, and I'll follow up to all of the participants, I'll curate all of these resources on that page for you. So you'll have those. So Catherine, thank you for sharing that. One of the things that I want to say here is what happens most often with people who come to me as potential clients is like, we did a survey, right? And I'm like, okay, tell me about your survey. And they're like, well, the survey says we don't have any cultural or climate issues. And I was like, I wonder why, right? And so the number one strategy I want to offer you is to don't do a survey. Because surveys very infrequently give us the information that we need. One of the models that I'm positioning as a solution instead of a survey is entering into a collective impact model where you're involving the people in your organization to do a SOAR analysis, so strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results. And I have some resources on my website that I'll share again with you after this session. But when you invite people, it's basically like a strategic planning model of saying, like, what are the strengths, what are the opportunities? And it allows people to really focus on those positive things and how we all want to move together forward. Because what happens so often when we have culture and climate things that we want to address is that we go to the people who've been traditionally marginalized and excluded, and we're like, hey, tell us about your trauma. Let's relive it. Please, you owe us an explanation. Like that, don't ask people to relive their traumas to help you understand the culture that you have been too blind to see, right? But if you invite people to come to the table and you're intentional of the selection of who's doing that, you can co-create and envision and look forward to creating kinds of solutions that are going to solve some of the issues that you're facing. So that's one of the tools that I recommend. I also recommend employing different kinds of tools and strategies and how you operate and function so that you're creating some shared language. And I've got a bunch of tools on the Engineer Inclusion website that you can use. Again, I'll reference those in the page. But like, we can't just sit around and say, hey, we want to improve culture and climate without a framework, without a tool, without something that's going to help us begin to make some policy and procedural changes. And so it's like creating guardrails for ourselves along the road, the journey that we want to do. Because if we don't have a direction, if we don't have some structure, we aren't all going to get there, right? And so again, tools like the nudge tool, creating shared group norms, teaching people about cognitive biases. Those are different than implicit biases, similar but different, and how those cognitive biases manifest in our hiring practices, using those kinds of shared language. I've got some tools on gatekeeping and stewarding and how do we develop stewardship amongst our culture and climate. So again, the best strategies I can offer is implement the practice and some accountability to how you use these tools, because again, it has to be a cultural shift in order to begin to see some of these results. Woodrow, Roz, any sort of last thoughts on practices as we're wrapping up here in the last couple of minutes?
Wow.
I think when we think about all of this, coming from an understanding that we don't know everything, right? Yeah. And that we are, if we're not learning, we're dying. And the idea that we have to continue to grow and evolve how we think about this, that consciously or subconsciously or unconsciously, we are shaped by our environment. And what we see and how we perceive things is directly a result of that. So when we don't see a problem, it is probably because we have been conditioned to not see a problem. And being able to open up your mind or think of things differently is scary as hell, right? But there is value and importance in doing that.
So true. Thanks, Roz. Last words from you, Woodrow.
No, I totally concur. And just, the accountability and accountability, not only to yourself, but to, the people that you lead and manage as well. And that's one of the things that that really kind of quote unquote keeps me up at night, because I really care. And having that sort of accountability as kind of a means by which that drives my thinking and acting, and it's also a cultural shift as well, to Roz's point. And this is one of the things that we've kind of begin to kind of explore within my unit as well. This whole notion of essential questions, so that there are more questions than answers. And to be okay with that. But that does require kind of this shift in thinking around, management and leadership, because and you articulated this, Meagan, the dominant model manager has all the answers. You shouldn't be throwing back a question, but in terms of truly evolving and responding to the changes in the organization and workplace, it is about that constant sort of questioning to kind of facilitate the needed evolution.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Roz Cohen and Dr. Woodrow Winchester, thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. I had fun. I hope y'all had fun too. I'm excited to curate all of the resources for the participants and for the people who view the recording of this moving forward. I value your feedback, so I dropped a link in the chat that you can offer your feedback and help us, help me at Engineer Inclusion improve our services. And again, I'll send a follow-up email. And so again, so grateful for all of your contributions and your energy. And until next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.